Welcome to Casual Politics. So,
Okay.
Malcolm, thank you very much for accepting my request. This is your second time. Thank you.
I can't resist somehow.
I know.
Eventually I will say sorry, can't do it anymore. I'll run out of things to say.
Best of three. So, but thank you very much. Just a few thoughts on your colleague, Jeffrey Howe, who passed away. And one of your, I know not your first, but one of your ministerial positions
yes.
was in his office.
Well, Jeffrey Howe was my boss for about 3 years before I joined the cabinet, and he was a very impressive man to work for. He had a rather quiet, rather shy manner, but very strong views, very determined to
But not
achieve
in substance. He was not shy in substance.
That is right. He was very meticulous, and therefore any speech he was making, he would call in his advisors, perhaps several times. He would think they'd reached a conclusion, and then Jeffrey would give further thought and have a further discussion with them and so forth. So he was very thorough, very careful. The exact opposite of his boss, Margaret Thatcher, which is why, of course, eventually they clashed.
And did you enjoy working alongside him?
I did, of course, and he also had a very splendid sense of humour, which makes life a lot easier. I remember one glorious occasion when Mrs. Thatcher was at Chequers, at her residence at Chequers, and she was due to see the President of South Africa that morning, Saturday morning, and Jeffrey, as Foreign Secretary, I, as the Minister dealing with Africa, had been asked to come earlier to give her a final briefing. And we both arrived separately, but at the same time, about 9 o'clock in the morning. And we were dropped by our cars, which disappeared. But the door was closed, the front door was closed, there was no sign of life. So we rang the doorbell, and nothing happened. We both looked at each other, and we both agreed. In fact, we both arrived at the same time, and it was unlikely that we got the timing. So we rang the doorbell again, and eventually we heard a noise out inside. And the door was opened by a young lady assistant, who was a bit flustered, still buttoning her tunic. And Jeffrey's first words were, "Good morning. We're calling on behalf of the Conservative Party." This poor young woman, who was already a bit flustered, just completely collapsed. It was very, very funny.
And is it right that you convinced him to ask Margaret Thatcher to just change government's policy on the Soviet Union?
Well, I don't claim full credit. I was one of a number of players, but broadly speaking, what you say is at least partly true. We were discussing within the Foreign Office what were then very poor links with Moscow, with the Soviet Union. And one of our senior diplomats mentioned there was a very new younger member of the Politburo, Mr. Gorbachev, and that we really ought to be trying to find out a bit more about it, because one day he might lead the Soviet Union. And, I was giving the same advice to Jeffrey Howe, and we discussed it, and one of the consequences was a seminar at Chequers, chaired by the Prime Minister, in which he discussed our wider policy towards the Soviet Union at that time. And one of the things that resulted from that was a decision to invite Mr. Gorbachev to London. I was there when he came, when he saw Mrs. Thatcher. In fact, I had to look after his wife, Larisa Gorbacheva, a remarkable lady, quite cerebral, quite intellectual. What we would call blue stocking, academic. And I remember as I was showing her around the library at Chequers, Mrs. Gorbachev said, through the interpreter, she didn't speak good English, she said, "I am delighted to be in England. I've always wanted to be in the country of Hobbes and Locke." Two English philosophers. Not the sort of comment you normally got from the wife of the Soviet minister.
And you got it.
Absolutely. So we got it that day.
Yeah. And actually, this year it was a very special year for you, because for your first time, you were not, over the last 41 years, you were not sitting on those green benches.
No, you got it wrong. You've got to hold on. I've got to correct you first of all. I was in the House of Commons from 1974 till 1997.
Yes.
And then I, along with all the other Scottish Conservatives, lost my seat.
You
The
were
Blair
back in
tsunami.
2005.
I was out of the House of Commons for 2 terms and then returned in 2005 and retired this year.
So do you miss those green benches?
No, not very much. You can't. When you've been somewhere for more than 30 years, and I'm in my late 60s.
Yes.
Time comes to
But
move.
still
Time
young.
comes to move.
Still young.
Of course, still young. But I don't believe in
To become Prime Minister.
Thank you. Well,
It's never too late.
Let's take these one stage at a time. I never wanted to remain in the House of Commons, until I was a geriatric, so just wandering in and not really contributing. So I'm as busy as ever, but I'm doing other things, which is actually rather nice. You asked me, you mentioned that maybe I might one day still be Prime Minister. Yeah, I
It's
do.
never too late.
No, well, it sometimes is, but I do recollect once being asked by someone who wasn't offering me the job, but said, "Would you like to be Prime Minister?" And I gave him a very honest reply. I said, "I'd love to have been Prime Minister." The job itself is dreadful. I mean, I've been very close to it when I worked with John Major and with Margaret Thatcher, and I can see the tremendous personal pressures, which are far, far greater for a Prime Minister than for even a senior cabinet minister. So it's not a job I would have enjoyed doing, but to have been Prime Minister, that's very different.
That's very different.
Then you get all the fun and none of the problem.
You're absolutely right. And the first time that you entered in Parliament was in 1974, and now we're in 2015. So in what ways your party has been transformed?
Well, we're talking about a total of almost 40 years, just over 40 years, and the world's moved on, Britain's moved on. And so the whole strength and unique quality of the Conservative Party is its adaptability. If you think the Conservatives are the longest serving political party in the world, the Conservative Party has been functioning against Tories, Conservatives, since 1700s, since before the United States even existed. Now the Labour Party was only created just over 100 years ago, and it was created with a particular ideology, socialism. And when that became out of date, redundant, the Labour Party has been
But so was
trying to find.
Conservatism.
No. Let me correct you on that. The Conservative Party has never had an ideology. It has values, it has principles, it has beliefs.
Liberalism.
Well, let me explain. Let me complete my sentence before you ask me the next question. The Labour Party there are certain things called ideologies: communism, fascism, socialism. Some of them may be very honourable, but they're relevant to society at a particular stage. They try to offer solutions to particular problems. The Conservative Party has never had an ideology. There's no ideology of conservatism. What we believe in is the rule of law, democracy, freedom, pluralism, allowing people to live their own lives, limiting the power of the state. Now these are timeless. They're not linked to any one century. And that is why the Conservative Party has survived and prospered for 300 years. But it hasn't been unchanging during that period. So what it has been is able to adapt to remarkably different circumstances. For example, there's a stuffy old Tory party that chose Margaret Thatcher, the first woman in the Western world, to become a head of government. You would have thought that might be the left-wing radical Labour Party. Far from it. The Labour Party and the trade unions are very conservative, small c. Women have had very few positions in the Labour Party, at least until very recently. The Conservative Party in the 19th century chose Disraeli, a maverick outsider, as its leader, who became one of its great prime ministers. It was the Conservative Party that extended the franchise dramatically in the 19th century and enfranchised many poorer people who did not have a vote until then. So the Conservative Party has always been a flexible, radical party. Its principles have been unchanging, but we've never had an ideology. And that's why some people on the right of the party get frustrated. They would like us to have one. And occasionally their views are, but even Margaret Thatcher, her rhetoric was right-wing. Her beliefs were right-wing, but as a Prime Minister, she was much more pragmatic, much more flexible in the circumstances required.
And will your party tear itself apart once more under the leadership of David Cameron, as it did actually before in the 90s under the leadership of John Major?
The only issue where I think you're referring to, you're talking about Europe, obviously. The short answer is no, it won't, for a very simple reason. There's going to be a referendum. The Conservative Party does not have to resolve that decision itself, the electorate. And sometime in the next couple of years we will have a referendum either on staying in the European Union or leaving. And yes, the Conservative Party will be divided on that issue. So will other parties, but we'll probably be more divided than the others. But that will be for the period of a referendum campaign. And we won't be attacking each other. The arguments that will be made will be for or against Britain remaining in the European Union. And the public will decide. and the party will reunite. Yes. Some will be pleased, some will be disappointed, but whatever the policy endorsed by the electorate is, either staying in the European Union or leaving it, that will be settled for at least a generation.
But referendums are divisive as well. In 1975, the Labour Party was split over the referendum, and then some of Labour Party's MPs, they defected and formed the so-called gang of
well, hold on,
SDP.
you're confusing two separate
Because
issues.
of the referendum.
No, forgive me. In 1975, Harold Wilson had a referendum on Europe, and you're quite right, the Labour Party was divided on that. But the split in the Labour Party, the Gang of Four, the creation of the SDP, was not till after 1979. That was after Mrs. Thatcher had won the election and Michael Foot had become leader of the Labour Party. That was 10 years later.
In the long term.
And it was nothing to do with Europe. But it was nothing to do with Europe. The split in the Labour Party in the 1970s under Michael Foot was how left-wing, rather like Jeremy Corbyn today, how left-wing was the Labour Party going to be. The issue of Europe had been addressed and dealt with by the referendum 10 years later. Although the Labour Party was behind it, and that created some short-term embarrassment, the Labour Party remained in government until 1979. And when it lost it had nothing to do with Europe.
Well, we already know that David Cameron would not actually renegotiate some of policies with his counterparts, mainly on free movement of people and also treaty changes. He would not discuss those two policies. So why then we're waiting for his renegotiations?
Well, 2 points. First of all, you say we already know. Well, in that case, you know more than I do, because quite rightly, if you're involved in a very delicate and difficult negotiation, you cannot announce to the world in advance what your negotiating details and tactics are. Because the whole point about negotiation is in a private but professional way to try to reach agreements that meet your requirements. Mrs. Merkel or President Hollande will make general statements, as does David Cameron. Nobody goes into detail because that's for the private negotiation. Once the negotiation has been complete, then of course you have to announce what you have agreed, and the public must make up their mind whether they approve of what has happened. Now, on the two particular points that you mentioned, the question of the free movement of people, that is about internal movement within the European Union. And the government have said right from the beginning that they accept that as a core principle of the European Union. The debate that is taking place is about entitlements to various welfare benefits from people who are not in employment or who may be in employment but who are receiving subsidies from the British taxpayer, and how available that should be to people with other citizenship. On the second point about treaty change, I frankly, and I don't think most people in Britain care very much whether you have a treaty change or not. The question is how do you get the reforms that are required, whether they need to be put into a treaty or not is a separate issue. That's about procedure. So as long as we can get some substantive changes, the kind that have been discussed in some of the speeches that have been made, I'm not going to lose any sleep over the requirement. In fact, a treaty change is not necessarily in our interest, because if you have a treaty change, it has to be endorsed by all 28 countries, and many of them would require their own referendums. So we could have a situation where we reached agreement with the heads of government, but in Slovenia or Bulgaria, in a referendum for some other reason, the public refused to endorse it. That would be pretty foolish. So treaty changes are not necessarily in our interest.
But the overwhelming majority of British people, they're in favor of controlling migration, and that will not happen until there is a treaty change. Do you agree with me?
Forgive me, again, you're confusing two separate issues. Much of the anxiety about migration is not from movement within the European Union, but from people from other parts of the world. So there's the whole crisis about...
But mainly within
Let me finish. No, I don't agree with you. So I'm sorry, I don't think that's right. Very large numbers of people in the European Union who come to Britain, stay for a few years and then return back. Most of them people from Poland, for example. We've all met people from Poland who are working in the United Kingdom at the moment, actually doing some very, very worthwhile jobs who are benefiting from their presence. You speak to most of them, as I've done to many who I've met, and you say, what is your long-term plan? They say, oh, I was going back to Poland. We've made some savings. So that's unlikely to have long-term demographic implications. Where there is more concern is if you have hundreds of thousands, or sometimes possibly even millions of people from other cultures, other parts of the world, who would be permanent residents, many of whom would be very worthwhile people, very viable new citizens. But like any country in the world, you have to have migration policy and controls. Britain is actually much more fortunate than most of the European Union for two reasons. First of all, we're not part of Schengen. We actually do control our own borders in terms of people having to demonstrate their entitlement to come here when they enter the United Kingdom. But secondly, we're an island. And being an island makes it physically far more difficult for illegal immigrants to get access to this country.
But your party failed because Theresa May 5 years ago she promised that they would keep the migration down to tens of thousands, and you're saying that they could control migration, but it seems that now they can't.
Well,
it's just out of control, isn't it?
Well, you are perfectly entitled to say that the target that the government set itself they did not meet, they have not met, and that clearly is egg on face for the people concerned. That is a significant issue.
There is a problem, isn't it?
Well, it comes down to a number of separate issues. It comes down, first of all, what do you do about people who say they are the dependents of people who are already here? Do you give them permission to come? Because that can sometimes be large numbers of people. It includes parents or children, brothers or sisters. There's also the question of students, who are not really migrants, but are sometimes treated as if they were. And I think that's wrong. I think if a person is a student coming for a specific period of study and then returning to their own country, then they're not immigrants in the normal sense of the word, but they're often included in the statistics. And there are people who illegally do manage to get into the country, and therefore sometimes you don't even know they're there. So I'm not pretending the issue is easy. It's far from easy. What I am saying is the United Kingdom has more tools at its disposal to control numbers than most continental countries, partly for reasons of geography, that we're an island, partly because we are not part of the Schengen open border system.
And one hypothetical question. As the former Secretary of State for Scotland, do you think that if Britain decides to leave the European Union, will it trigger another referendum over the Scottish?
I've heard this being speculated. I think people are being fooled, if they believe this, by Scottish nationalist propaganda. The SNP want to create as much division as possible between Scotland and England. And they would like to foster the impression that England is very Eurosceptic and Scotland is very Europhile, very pro-European Union. When you look a bit more closely, let me just give some hard examples of why that's not actually a very convincing position for the SNP to take. For many years, the SNP said, when we're an independent Scotland, we'll join the Euro. That will be our currency. We had the Eurozone crisis a couple of years ago. What did the SNP suddenly do? They stood on their head. They realised that they're not going to persuade people to vote for independence. That means joining the Euro. So suddenly they ditched that and said, we love the pound. The British pound is our currency as well. We must be allowed to share the pound. Why not join the Euro? All the other countries of Europe, most of them, are in the Euro. If Scotland is so passionately pro-European compared to England, why did the SNP ditch their policy? And remember the last European Parliament elections, when none of us, including the SNP, expected UKIP to do well in Scotland. They actually won a seat. They got 10% of the vote in a five-party system. So there may be marginal differences in opinion. It may be the opinion poll will suggest Scotland is less Eurosceptic than England. But the issue is one of 2 or 3 percentage points, not some dramatic difference that would lead to any fundamental change.
What was responsible for the rise of nationalism in Scotland?
Well, it's not just a Scottish phenomenon. I mean, if you look at what has been...
It's more
well, let me finish the point.
Than Welsh phenomenon.
Sorry.
Yes.
If you let me finish.
Yes, right.
Mrs. Thatcher once interrupted an ambassador so many times that he stopped and said, Mrs. Thatcher, if you didn't interrupt me so often, you might find you didn't need to. Okay? The point I was going to make was that the rise of nationalism is not just a Scottish phenomenon or a British phenomenon. It is something which you just look around Europe as a whole. You see in Belgium, the Flemings and the Walloons, each saying they should have their own separate political state. You have Catalans and Basques in Spain, Catalonia, demanding independence from Spain, or many Catalans demanding. You have the Northern League in Italy. So there are examples of this Corsica and elsewhere. So what we have seen, and it's partly the consequence of the European Union, that as the European Union has been created, some of the small national communities in larger states say, well, maybe we should be a separate member of the EU to get the best of both worlds. Now, I don't think it's going to end like that, because when the debate becomes a little bit more sophisticated, people realise that if you break up an existing state, you lose a lot, as well as having the possibility of gaining some benefits. And in the case of the Scottish situation, even since the referendum, will the SNP remain a very, very strong party? It's not because of independence. The arguments for independence have collapsed because of the oil price. The gap that would now exist in the Scottish budget, if they relied on North Sea oil, would be something like £7 billion a year, which would have to be met by either additional taxation or reduced spending. So, at the end of the day, that's what people are anxious about.
As the former Foreign Secretary, are you worried that Jeremy Corbyn said if he becomes Prime Minister, he will not press on the button?
Well, I don't want to make it sound as if I have the remotest expectation that Jeremy Corbyn will ever become Prime Minister. And I think, when I say I think that's highly unlikely, I think most of the Labour Party would share that as well. We desperately hope he doesn't, because it would be a complete disaster. I mean, by making the remark he did, he actually showed why, whether he's left wing or right wing, he's unfit to be Prime Minister, because the whole basis of nuclear weapons, whether you approve of them or not, is deterrence. It's not that anybody wants to use nuclear weapons. It is that you have to actually deter a potential aggressor who has their own nuclear weapons, that they will not be able to be aggressive without paying a very heavy penalty. Now, if you say in advance, whatever you do to me, although I have the capability to retaliate, I will never use it. Deterrence disappears, and aggression becomes much more likely. And sadly, we're living in a Europe where the relations between Russia and the West are poorer.
But Dennis Healey as well, once he said that he would not press on the button, and now we're talking about, actually when we talk about him, we just say that he was the best Prime Minister that Britain ever had. So don't you think that the media, especially metropolitan press, are just making fuss over this issue?
No, well, I don't know where you got that quotation from Dennis Healey, but Dennis Healey never supported unilateral disarmament. He was Defence Secretary. He had responsibility under the Prime Minister for our nuclear deterrence. So I don't believe, I don't know where you got this alleged quote from. The reality is, of course, no Prime Minister would be other than anguished at having to make a decision as to whether you renew different nuclear weapons. Of course, it's an incredibly painful decision. When I became Foreign Secretary, John Major, Prime Minister, got a message from him saying that in the event of some huge crisis which might involve Britain being threatened, if he as Prime Minister was unavailable to deal with it, then policy was that he had to nominate one or two people, senior ministers, who would take his place for that purpose. I was informed that I would be number 3. Mr. Heseltine, who was Deputy Prime Minister, would be number 2. So, thankfully, this was 1995. The Cold War was over. There was no serious possibility of any conflict. It was still a rather, in terms of I think that certainly unforeseen circumstances, we could actually have that kind of responsibility, was pretty daunting. So, if that was all that Mr. Corbyn said, he would be just making a perfectly normal response, but he just does not have the experience or the maturity to realise how a Prime Minister carries awesome responsibilities, which cannot just be dismissed by saying, I never know something.
But now that we're talking about nuclear deterrence, do you think that that now what's happening in Syria, we will see a proxy war in future time, in the foreseeable future between the United States and Russia? Will it be a proxy war?
No, a proxy war implies that the two countries concerned want to go to war with each other, but do it through local allies. I don't think there's any desire of that kind. I don't think there's even a desire on the Russian side for conflict of that kind. There are some fundamental differences of view about Syria, whether the Assad regime deserves support. that is a genuine difference of view. And it is indeed dangerous when you have the Russians bombing in Syria and the risk of that, of coming into conflict with aircraft from other members of the international community. So there's some real issues that have to be addressed. Proxy wars have to be addressed.
But Russians, they already shot some of American forces last week.
I'm not aware that they shot them, so I don't.
But they said that it was by mistake, so meaning that they already declared war.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not aware of any Americans who were killed by Russians in Syria. In any event, if accidents happen, then that is not the same as attempt to attack an enemy.
And to combat ISIS in Iraq, we're talking about a coalition not only of Gulf countries but also Western countries. But do you think is that happening or not at the moment?
Well, it's happening, but it's not as broad a coalition as it should be, and that's why when Russia first said that they wanted to be part of that international action, most of us welcomed that. That would have been a very positive development. Now, the Russians are launching some of their air attacks on ISIS targets, but all the evidence suggests the vast majority are not on ISIS targets, but on the moderate Syrian opposition that is fighting Assad. And that is pouring oil onto a fire. It's very, very dangerous and very unfortunate.
But why Gulf countries are not very active to combat ISIS, especially Saudi Arabia?
Saudi Arabia has been more active than it's been in the past. But I agree with you that the main threat that ISIS poses is not to the United Kingdom or to the United States. It is a serious threat, but it's not. We're not their main target. Their main target actually is Saudi Arabia and the United States. And after that, Russia is more the target because of its proximity to the Middle East. So there ought to be a more cohesive international response.
So do you believe that David Cameron should call for another intervention in Syria and Iran?
Well, what is being contemplated is something rather different to 2 or 3 years ago. When the government was defeated in the House of Commons, that was a question of whether the government should have the authority to allow airstrikes against the Assad regime. What is being contemplated now is whether the kind of airstrikes that are being used against ISIS in Iraq should also be available if they include the Royal Air Force in Syria as well. And I know that it's sensible. ISIS doesn't recognize the border of Syria and Iraq. It treats it as a single battle area. And it is ludicrous to allow self-reliant ordinance defenses responding in the most effective way.
And two last quick questions. The first one is that what are the changes that you expect your government to do, substantial changes over the next 5 years?
In what areas of policy do you mean?
Any welfare or foreign policy?
Sure. Obviously, the main issue that will dominate the political debate will be the referendum, and also the hopefully successful conclusion of the austerity period of the government's economic policy. Britain at the moment has an economy that thankfully is stronger than anywhere else in Europe. We have more growth, we have more serious falls in unemployment. That is very, very healthy. But the public finance is still not proper balance. Therefore, some austerity will continue for periods of time. And I think it must be part of the government's objective at the time we face the next budget. Austerity will be the thing.
My last question. As House of Lords, it's all about expertise, and you've got that expertise. It's for sure, and you've been cleared off any allegations against you. So have the Prime Minister contacted you and asked you to go and sit in the Lords as a lifetime peer, because you deserve to be there?
I have no idea what the future holds. I have not.
But has he contacted you?
Well, the previous Prime Minister, John Major, gave me the opportunity, if I wanted to go to the Lords in 1997. And that was very generous of him, and I said that I prefer to return to the House of Commons. So let's just take one issue at a time.
So we shall wait and see. Thank you very much. It's great. Thank you.